Global energy scarcity. This is where everything started going wrong. And honestly, it's the most realistic disaster in the entire Fallout universe. Despite having nuclear technology everywhere, petroleum and critical feedstocks became severe choke points that disrupted civilian logistics, agriculture, and industry. Nuclear energy couldn't magically replace liquid fuels for shipping, aviation, and mechanized warfare, so oil remained strategically decisive even in a nuclear-powered world. The shortages triggered massive price spikes, rationing, and protectionist policies that turned trade disputes into territorial wars over oil fields, uranium, and rare metals. Agricultural yields collapsed from fuel scarcity and fertilizer constraints, creating food insecurity that fed social unrest and justified harsher government controls. Once energy scarcity became the master variable defining state behavior, international cooperation became impossible, and escalation became inevitable. But if you thought energy shortages were bad, the next disaster normalized emergency powers that never went away. Tel Aviv nuclear detonation. In 2053, a nuclear device detonated in Tel Aviv, creating the first watershed moment that changed everything about how governments approach security. Whether the attack came from terrorists, a rogue state, or some deniable actor didn't matter, the political effect was immediate and catastrophic. The explosion collapsed risk tolerance worldwide and accelerated security maximalism as every government realized that a single device could completely reorder their political system overnight. The response was predictable: expanded surveillance, border controls, and counter-proliferation operations that gave militaries broader domestic authorities and bent legal standards around exceptional threats. Civil liberties narrowed first, temporarily, then permanently, as sunset clauses were quietly ignored and emergency powers became the new normal. The WMD shock created the legal machinery later used for mass quarantines, crackdowns, and wartime mobilization. If you thought nuclear terrorism was terrifying, the next disaster turned public health into a national security issue. The new plague. The blue flu emerged as a highly lethal pathogen that drove quarantines, travel restrictions, and the complete militarization of disease response. Governments framed the pandemic as a national security problem rather than a public health challenge, leading to censorship, disinformation, and heavy-handed containment measures that destroyed public trust. Economic productivity dropped while medical and security costs soared, creating the perfect conditions for riots and resistance that were met with curfews and forced isolation. The bureaucracy built to contain disease became a permanent instrument of social coercion that would later enable human experimentation and mass quarantines. Biolabs expanded under emergency authorizations with loosened ethics frameworks, creating the foundation for dual-use programs that would eventually produce the forced evolutionary virus. But the next disaster showed how corporations could weaponize civil defense itself. Corporate capture of civil defense. Vault-Tec transformed what should have been a legitimate shelter network into a vehicle for mass human experimentation disguised as protection. The company used procurement corruption, regulatory capture, and national security exemptions to subordinate oversight and ethics to black budget objectives and corporate profit. Meanwhile, Robco and General Atomics saturated civilian spaces with robots and automated systems designed with military priorities, introducing massive safety and escalation risks to daily life. The institutions meant to safeguard society were structurally repurposed to serve corporate and government experiments rather than public welfare. Profit-driven research and development combined with secrecy clauses allowed systemic risks to accumulate without the transparency or fail-safes that would exist in purely public systems. If you thought corporate corruption was bad, the next disaster created the geopolitical rivalry that would end the world. Sino-American rivalry formation. The United States and China locked into a zero-sum competition over remaining energy and strategic materials that transformed trade friction into an existential struggle for global dominance. Both superpowers began treating supply chains as battlefields, weaponizing economics and preparing for direct military confrontation. European fragmentation from fuel scarcity removed a potential stabilizing force and created additional flashpoints that increased panic buying and resource hoarding. Rationing, conscription-adjacent labor measures, and emergency industrial policies became normalized as both nations prepared their entire societies for prolonged conflict. Once the great power rivalry hardened against a backdrop of fragmented allies and failing markets, a long war became not just thinkable, but inevitable. But the rivalry was about to explode into open warfare. The resource wars. Competition for dwindling resources pushed nations beyond trade instruments into seizures, blockades, and proxy fighting. As Europe fragmented under fuel stress and political breakdown, Export controls, nationalizations, and convoy interdictions became routine international practice, completely collapsing trust in global markets and forcing neutral actors to either arm up or pick sides. Food and fuel lines lengthened everywhere as industrial priorities shifted to armaments and logistics, sidelining consumer needs and inflaming domestic unrest. Economic warfare became standard practice as states prosecuted trade disputes through military means, shortening escalation ladders and making every supply shock carry a potential military response. Once economics was conducted by other means, the path to total war became a highway with no exit ramps. The resource wars show that when trade becomes warfare, actual warfare becomes inevitable. But if you thought proxy conflicts were dangerous, the superpowers were about to go head-to-head. Sino-American War begins. In 2066, the United States and China moved from strategic rivalry to open warfare, fielding power armor, advanced drones, and cyber capabilities in a conflict that would consume both nations. Neither side achieved decisive breakthroughs, leading to hardened fronts and attritional warfare that required both economies to reorient toward permanent mobilization. Draft pressures, war bonds, and emergency industrial directives tightened the screws on civilian life, while dissent was increasingly framed as sabotage or enemy influence. The long conventional war under scarcity conditions guaranteed complete societal militarization and raised the probability of catastrophic miscalculation as both sides became desperate for decisive advantages. What started as a resource competition became an existential struggle that would consume everything both civilizations had built. But the war was about to get even more brutal with territorial expansion. U.S. annexation of Canada. The United States invaded and occupied Canada to secure northern supply lines, staging grounds, and resource routes, citing wartime necessity over international law. The occupation featured curfews, checkpoints, and counterinsurgency operations, with documented abuses and reprisals that deepened Canadian resentment and international condemnation. Footage and testimony from the occupation inflamed debates at home but were used to justify tighter domestic controls rather than policy reform. The annexation exemplified wartime expediency, completely trumping legitimacy, eroding international norms, and creating a template for domestic suppression. The brutal occupation showed how quickly democratic nations could become imperial occupiers when resources and survival were at stake. If you thought foreign occupation was bad, the homeland was becoming a police state. Normalization of martial law. Temporary curfews extended indefinitely, while ID checks and armed patrols became ubiquitous features of American life. National Guard and federal troops began supporting or replacing civilian police in hot zones as surveillance of communications, travel, and employment became the default rather than the exception. Armored vehicles in city streets, ration distribution under armed guard, and protest policing with battlefield equipment blurred the line between warfront and homefront. Sunset clauses on emergency powers were quietly ignored as repressive stability replaced responsive governance, making course corrections politically impossible and policy errors increasingly dangerous. The permanent emergency state created conditions where citizens lived under military occupation in their own country, but the government was secretly developing even more dangerous programs. Black budget weapons expansion. Classified labs accelerated dual-use biological research under wartime waivers, loosening ethical and safety constraints in pursuit of military force multipliers. Procurement surged for power armor, combat robots, and autonomous defense networks, with safety interlocks and oversight sacrificed for rapid deployment schedules. The complexity of new weapon systems compressed decision timelines and increased the odds that false positives or technical glitches could trigger disasters. Secret programs accumulated massive tail risks, completely outside public view, while technical complexity shrunk the margin for human judgment and control. The race for technological superiority created weapons that were more dangerous to their operators than their intended targets. If you thought secret weapons were scary, social breakdown was accelerating everything. Shortages and urban riots. Food, fuel, and medicine intermittently failed to reach population centers as wartime logistics prioritized military needs over civilian survival. Q violence, strikes, and sabotage proliferated as protests over basic necessities morphed into broader anti-war and anti-occupation movements. The security response involved tighter curfews, expanded checkpoints, and increasingly lethal crowd control as National Guard deployments normalized in high-risk districts. Public cooperation collapsed under visible inequity and heavy-handed policing, pushing more economic activity into black markets and making accurate situational awareness impossible for officials. The feedback loop of scarcity, leading to unrest, leading to crackdowns, leading to more scarcity, created an unstoppable spiral toward complete social breakdown. But the pandemic response was making everything worse. New plague containment spiral. Outbreak clusters triggered city block lockdowns, forced relocations, and long-term quarantine zones as travel permits and health passes became prerequisites for work and basic movement. Conflicting government guidance, censorship, and rumored disappearances hollowed out public compliance, while people hid symptoms to avoid detention, actually accelerating disease spread. Sick-outs and absenteeism degraded transportation and manufacturing, compounding existing shortages and creating a vicious cycle where disease response made everything worse. Treating the pandemic primarily as a security issue rather than a health challenge produced brittle containment measures that backfired spectacularly. The infrastructure built for disease control became the pipeline for secret human experimentation and social control. If you thought pandemic mismanagement was bad, biological weapons research was crossing every ethical line. FEV research intensification. The Forced Evolutionary Virus Program moved from exploratory research into aggressive human trials seeking rapid soldier enhancement, pathogen countermeasures, and radiation resistance. Containment breaches, unreported fatalities, and off-book partner laboratories proliferated as research timelines shortened, and oversight was compartmentalized away from public scrutiny. Internal whistleblowing was criminalized as treason, while leaders under pressure gave political cover to increasingly risky lines of biological inquiry. Scientists bet that a single breakthrough in human enhancement would offset systemic military disadvantage, leading to experiments that crossed every possible ethical boundary. FEV became the ultimate symbol of technocratic overreach, UN attempt to hack human biology for military victory that instead created enduring post-war nightmares. But even the last hope for civilians was being corrupted. Vault-Tec Experimental Network. Whatever civil defense veneer remained was completely displaced by experimental matrices designed for behavioral, sociological, and biomedical research rather than actual protection. Funding flowed through classified channels with minimal auditing, while site-level autonomy allowed extreme protocols that were often unknown even to regional authorities. Public messaging pushed Vault enrollment as salvation, while selection and capacity were deliberately manipulated for experimental variables, ensuring most communities would be completely unprotected when collapse came. The last best hope for civilian survival was structurally repurposed to serve research agendas, guaranteeing that preparedness would not prevent mass casualties. Vault-Tec transformed nuclear shelters into human experimentation laboratories disguised as safety measures. If you thought corrupted shelters were the final betrayal, the military was building systems that could end the world by accident. Hair-trigger nuclear systems. Integrated early warning networks, automatic retargeting, and launch-on-warning doctrines reduced leaders' decision time to seconds or minutes during ambiguous incidents. Combat robots, sentry platforms, and semi-autonomous defense nodes received broader rules of engagement with loosened safety interlocks to prevent paralysis, ironically increasing friendly fire and false positive risks. Secrecy and compartmentalization prevented holistic risk assessment, while localized errors and spoofing gained system-level consequences. Complex, tightly coupled nuclear command systems with poor transparency became primed for catastrophic cascades from minor technical perturbations. The combination of automation, compressed timelines, and degraded human oversight created conditions where World War III could start from a computer glitch. But all these disasters were converging toward one final catastrophe: diplomatic collapse and stalemate. After years of the Sino-American War, both superpowers were locked in costly attrition with no decisive breakthrough, hardening political positions and eliminating diplomatic off-ramps. Exhausted societies living under scarcity, coercion, and opaque government programs had no resilience left for additional shocks. Decision-makers increasingly relied on fragile technical systems and black-box military programs to compensate for political weakness, magnifying the impact of any glitches or provocations. With containment failing, vaults compromised as experimental tools, and biological weapons crossing ethical boundaries, de-escalation became politically toxic for leaders on both sides. The structural conditions created by decades of mismanagement made a decisive, disastrous endgame, the path of least resistance. But this was nothing compared to the disaster that ended everything: the Great War. On October 23, 2077, someone launched nuclear weapons and everyone else followed suit, turning the entire planet into a radioactive wasteland in just 2 hours. Whether it was China, America, or some third party that fired first didn't matter. The hair-trigger systems and compressed decision timelines meant that once the first missiles launched, automated retaliation became inevitable. The global thermonuclear exchange annihilated cities across the world as decades of accumulated disasters finally converged into the ultimate catastrophe: Every structural failure, every emergency power, every militarized system, and every ethical compromise had built toward this moment when human civilization destroyed itself in a single afternoon. The Great War was not an accident, but the inevitable result of every pre-war disaster creating the conditions for humanity's suicide. Appalachian quarantines. West Virginia became a testing ground for extreme containment measures as the government used the region's rural isolation to experiment with large-scale population control. The Appalachian quarantines went far beyond normal disease containment, essentially turning entire counties into open-air prisons where residents couldn't leave and outsiders couldn't enter. The region's coal mining infrastructure and scattered communities made it perfect for testing how far authorities could push emergency powers without major urban resistance. Local populations were subjected to experimental containment protocols, forced relocations, and resource restrictions that served as a preview of post-war vault experiments. The quarantines showed how easily rural America could be sacrificed for the greater good when urban centers needed scapegoats for policy failures. Appalachian quarantines prove that isolated communities become laboratories for authoritarian experiments when nobody's watching. Commonwealth militarization. The Boston area became a fortress state as Massachusetts transformed into a military zone, preparing for potential Chinese invasion or domestic uprising. The Commonwealth militarization involved converting civilian infrastructure into military installations, establishing checkpoints between cities, and placing the entire region under de facto martial law. Universities, hospitals, and research facilities were repurposed for weapons development, while National Guard units became permanent occupying forces in their own neighborhoods. The militarization process tested how completely a civilian society could be transformed into a military one, while maintaining the fiction of normal governance. Boston's transformation showed how quickly American cities could become armed camps when fear overwhelmed constitutional protections. Commonwealth militarization shows that when governments prepare for war at home, home becomes the battlefield. D.C. Continuity of government entrenchment. The nation's capital became a bunker state, as federal authorities prepared elaborate plans for maintaining government control after nuclear war or complete social collapse. Washington, D.C.'s continuity of government entrenchment involved building extensive underground facilities, establishing shadow command structures, and creating protocols for martial law that would survive the destruction of normal democratic institutions. The capital region was transformed into a fortress designed to preserve federal power regardless of what happened to the American people. Secret facilities, redundant command centers, and automated systems were designed to keep the government running even if most of the population died. The entrenchment showed how the federal government prioritized its own survival over protecting the citizens it claimed to serve. D.C. Continuity of government entrenchment proves that when push comes to shove, governments always save themselves first. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every Fallout cryptid explained, click the video on the screen.